Thanks to NordVPN for sponsoring this video. This is Tibet. Located northeast of India, it's bordered by the Himalayas to the south and sprawling grasslands to the north and east. With an average elevation of about 14,000 feet, most of Tibet exists on the highest plateau on the planet. This is why it's sometimes called the roof of the world, and Tibetans refer to their homeland as the land of snows. The vast majority of Tibetans practice a form of Buddhism that scholars call Tibetan Buddhism, which is also practiced by many people in the Tibetan cultural sphere of influence in Bhutan, Nepal, Mongolia, and the Himalayan parts of India. And the traditions and beliefs associated with Tibetan Buddhism are surprisingly visible on the world stage. You might recognize Tibetan prayer flags or mandalas, or maybe you've heard of the esoteric practice of Tantra. But chances are you've encountered Tibetan Buddhism if you recognize this man, Tenzin Gyatso, otherwise known as His Holiness the Dalai Lama. He is the spiritual leader of Tibetan Buddhism, and he's known for traveling around the world speaking to audiences of tens of thousands at a time, sometimes meeting with celebrities and world leaders at the United Nations. And though he's sometimes mistaken as some sort of Pope of all of Buddhism, he's actually a specifically Tibetan Buddhist leader, the 14th person to hold the title of Dalai Lama, in a lineage stretching back to the 15th century. But what is Tibetan Buddhism? What distinguishes it from other Buddhist traditions? And where do its unique practices and concepts come from? Buddhism was established in Tibet in the 7th century CE. This is significant because it's quite a bit later than the rest of Asia. Buddhism was prevalent in China by the 1st century CE, and between the 3rd and 6th centuries made its way into Korea and Japan. So by the time Buddhism made its way up to the roof of the world, Tibetans could draw on centuries of already well-established Indian Buddhist philosophy and traditions, which we'll cover later. Before its arrival, Tibetans engaged in highly localized practices of praying and making offerings to spirits and deities who were thought to inhabit the Tibetan landscape. Scholars call these pre-Buddhist beliefs and practices Bun, which is often characterized as the local indigenous religion of Tibet. Though this era of Tibetan religion is very poorly understood, the earliest attestations of the word Bun refers not to a religion, but to a type of priest who conducts specific ceremonies such as funerals. In fact, some scholars wonder if Bun was actually just another form of Buddhism mixed with local indigenous traditions. But however we characterize these indigenous practices, there's no doubt that pre-Buddhist beliefs and practices had a significant influence on the development of Buddhism in Tibet. A lot of the ritual that we find in Tibetan Buddhism today, like Tibetan prayer flags, can be linked to pre-Buddhist traditions. And Bun and Buddhism have continued to mutually influence each other in Tibetan religious communities to this day. So some Buddhist influence may have reached Tibet before the 7th century, but official patronage of Buddhism arrived by way of a king named Songtsen Gampo. Actually, it was the king's 2 wives who are credited with introducing Buddhism there. Princess Wangcheng came from China and brought with her a statue of the Buddha called the Zhouwo. To this day, this statue is still enshrined in the capital city Lhasa in the Jokhang Temple, and Tibetans revere it as the most sacred image of the Buddha. It's believed that this statue was personally blessed by the Buddha himself and was carved in his image. Songtsen Gampo's second wife came from Nepal and brought with her her own Buddha statue as well. Both of these women are revered by Tibetan Buddhists as incarnations of the Bodhisattva Tara, while Songtsen Gampo is revered as an emanation of the Bodhisattva of compassion, Avalokiteshvara, known as Chenrezig in Tibet, and one of the most prominent bodhisattvas in Tibetan Buddhism. According to tradition, Avalokiteshvara was charged to convert Tibet by Shakyamuni Buddha himself. The Dalai Lama is also believed to be an incarnation of this bodhisattva, and the Potala Palace, the winter palace of the Dalai Lama located in Lhasa, is named after the Pure Land of Avalokiteshvara, which, as we explored in a previous video, are the purified realms or spheres of influence of specific Buddhas and bodhisattvas, that we can think of kind of like a Mahayana multiverse. After the reign of Songtsen Gampo, the next king, Trisong Detsen, took the throne in the 8th century, and he immediately got to work establishing Buddhism as the state religion. He was particularly interested in the forms of Buddhism that were being practiced in India, and so he recruited Buddhist scholars and practitioners from India to come to Tibet. According to tradition, he tried to build a monastery, but the construction encountered countless difficulties. Legend has it that whatever progress was made on the monastery during the day was mysteriously undone each night. The locals began to believe that the local spirits were sabotaging the construction because they didn't want to see a new religion take hold in Tibet. So the king invited the semi-legendary tantric master Padmasambhava. He reportedly traveled around Tibet and subjugated the local spirits, turning them into protectors of Buddhism, thus enabling the monastery's construction to be finished. And here we'll take a quick detour exploring Padmasambhava, because he's vitally important in Tibetan Buddhism. Padmasambhava, whose name means lotus-born, was reportedly an Indian Buddhist practitioner and tantric master, who is believed to have supernatural powers. Tibetan Buddhists call him Guru Rinpoche, or precious teacher, and they revere him as a figure on par with the Buddha himself. He's even believed to be an emanation of Amitabha Buddha, the most prominent Buddha in Pure Land Buddhism and the Buddha of the most prominent Pure Land, Sukhavati. Sometimes Padmasambhava is even referred to as the second Buddha, because without him, Buddhism never would have taken hold in Tibet. There's actually not that much we can say about Padmasambhava as a historical figure, but his story is an important part of Tibetan Buddhist conception of their religious history. He's regarded as the founder of the Nyingma school, one of the 4 major monastic orders of Tibetan Buddhism, the other 3 being Kagyu, Geluk, and Shakya. After Padmasambhava's visit, Buddhism quickly began to spread as the state-sponsored religion. Eventually, Tibetan Buddhism organized itself into a number of different sects, and the next few centuries saw fierce political battles between these groups, as their leaders attempted to gain power and control. We're going to jump ahead to the 15th century, when a new sect was formed that changed the course of Tibetan Buddhism, a school that eventually became known as the Geluk school, also known as the Yellow Hats. We're jumping ahead to this point in history because here's when the Dalai Lama enters the scene. The Geluk school eventually waded into the political infighting, and after a couple hundred years, and with the patronage of the Mongol rulers, they came out on top as the biggest and most politically dominant Buddhist sect in Tibet. In particular, Sonam Gyatso, the leader of a prominent Geluk monastery, allied with the Mongol leader Altan Khan, and Sonam Gyatso received the title Dalai Lama. The word Dalai is actually a Mongolian title meaning ocean, while a lama is the Tibetan equivalent to the Sanskrit word guru. In Tibetan Buddhism, it refers to religious teachers who guide the spiritual life of the individual and of the community. The title can be applied to monks, nuns, tantric practitioners, or even lay people, the most prominent lama being the Dalai Lama. So Dalai Lama means oceanic guru, and it's a title meant to convey the leader's vast ocean-like wisdom. Although Sonam Gyatso is the first to be called Dalai Lama, the title was retroactively applied to 2 previous men, and Sonam Gyatso was identified as their reincarnation. And here's where we should talk about what's called the Tulku system, or identified reincarnation. This is a custom of identifying a baby as the rebirth of a specific leader, and educating the child to assume his predecessor's title and function. Basically, a tulku is an individual in a reincarnation lineage. The Dalai Lama is the most prominent example of such a lineage. The current Dalai Lama, like his predecessors, is believed to be a tulku. He was identified by other monks and formally installed as the leader of the Tibetan people when he was just 3 years old, following a system of tests in which he selected a number of items that had belonged to the previous Dalai Lama. But there are other reincarnation lineages, such as the Panchen Lama, a spiritual leader second to the Dalai Lama and who's charged with finding the next Dalai Lama. And in fact, there have been thousands of tulkus throughout Tibetan history, in all 4 major schools of Tibetan Buddhism. In the 17th century, the 5th Dalai Lama, Lobsang Gyatso, was installed by the Mongol leader as the ruler of Tibet, and from then on, the Dalai Lama functioned as a religious and political leader of Tibet. So from this brief sketch of history, we've seen some unique elements that would influence this branch of Buddhism, from the influence of Bön practices to the Tulku system and the lineage of the Dalai Lama, who still chooses to be reborn again and again in order to serve as a teacher. We'll next turn to some major philosophical ideas in Tibetan Buddhism. Philosophically, Tibetan Buddhism falls under the umbrella of Mahayana. This is a development in Buddhism that happened in India sometime around the turn of the millennium, about 500 years after the Buddha lived. The word Mahayana means great vehicle. Vehicle here means the thing that's going to take you to your goal of awakening, and great meaning expansive or big. So the Mahayana is the vehicle that everybody can ride in. It's big enough to encompass all beings, so that everybody can attain awakening just like the Buddha. Mahayana is distinguished from earlier forms of Buddhism by its emphasis on 2 related ideas: emptiness and compassion. We'll start with the concept of emptiness, which emerges from the philosophical tradition called Madhyamaka. the teachings of the Indian Buddhist philosopher Nagarjuna, which is extremely influential in Tibetan Buddhism. In fact, Madhyamaka philosophy is part of the core curriculum of Tibetan monastic colleges. Now, we don't have time to do a full-on philosophy course on this topic, but for our purposes, the important thing to understand is that emptiness, or shunyata, does not mean nothingness. When Tibetan Buddhists say that all things are empty, what they're actually saying is that everything that exists in an intimate, intricate web of connection. Tibetan Buddhists call this interdependence. So emptiness basically means that all things are empty of an independent sort of existence. As an example, let's think about a bicycle. We can understand that a bike is actually made up of a whole bunch of other parts: wheels, handlebars, brakes, and so on. And all of those things were manufactured by different people in different places out of different materials. Now, if we zoom out even more and we think about a person who works at the rubber factory who helped make the tires, and the person who helped mine the aluminum for the frame, we soon realize that they actually depend on other things in order to exist as well. Those people need food to eat, so they rely on the farmers who grow their food, and the truckers who ship it to the store. And those farmers depend on water to irrigate their crops, and those truckers depend on oil to fuel their trucks. If you think about it enough, you soon realize that something as simple as a bike actually relies on an infinite number of other things to exist. So a Tibetan Buddhist teacher might say the bicycle is not something that exists independently, it exists interdependently. It relies on a whole network of other things in order to exist, and it's therefore empty of an independent sort of existence. Now, this sort of reasoning applies to people as well. If I think about any aspect of my identity, I can see that it relies on others in order to exist. I'm a YouTuber that exists interdependently with the existence of the corporation YouTube, and you all, the audience. All of the things that make me depend on other people who are not me. So Tibetan Buddhists would say that I am also empty of an independent existence. All of the different aspects of my identity exist interdependently. So if we take these connected ideas of emptiness and interdependence and apply them broadly to people, we start to see that we all, in a sense, depend on each other. And this is where the next key idea in Tibetan Buddhist philosophy comes into play: compassion. Once you start to realize that everyone depends on everyone else, then you start to realize that your own happiness and suffering is wrapped up in the happiness and suffering of others. And so the quest for awakening is not just about you anymore, it's about everybody. And so we need compassion. Seeking awakening for yourself is not enough. You need to practice compassion and attempt to help all beings without exception to overcome their own suffering and find lasting happiness as well. Another tulku, the 41st Shakya treason, says that we don't even need to get too philosophical about this idea. Even from a worldly perspective, if we alone are safe and enjoying great pleasures, but the rest of our family is in great suffering, if we are good-hearted people, we will not be happy. From this, we can recognize that it is not right to seek happiness or liberation just for ourselves. We need to consider the welfare of all sentient beings. A person who dedicates their life to cultivating compassion and working for the benefit of others is called a bodhisattva. Bodhisattvas promise to spend their life or many lifetimes dedicated to understanding emptiness and interdependence and practicing compassion. The practices that Tibetan Buddhists do are all grounded within this basic framework of the bodhisattva ideal. So we talked about some of the philosophy of Tibetan Buddhism, but what about its practices? When people imagine practicing Buddhists, they tend to imagine calm and serene meditators, sitting alone on top of a mountain. You can watch our video on meditation for more on why this is not the most accurate way to think about Buddhist meditation. And the practice of Tibetan Buddhism involves a whole lot more than this. In general, we can talk about two basic frameworks for Tibetan Buddhist practice. There's the practice of the paramitas, or perfections, what we can call paramitayana, and then there's the practice of tantra, sometimes referred to as vajrayana. Let's start with paramitayana, or the gradual cultivation of the paramitas or perfections. Generally speaking, the perfections are the sorts of qualities that Buddhists believe should be cultivated, or perfected, through their religious practice. Some Buddhist traditions lay out 10 perfections, but in the form of Mahayana Buddhism that made its way to Tibet, these are condensed into 6. generosity, discipline, patience, diligence, meditative concentration, and wisdom. Bodhisattvas, in their attempts to understand the philosophical ideas of emptiness and compassion, dedicate themselves to working sincerely and deliberately on perfecting these 6 qualities. This is believed to take many, many lifetimes. These sorts of qualities are perfected through different kinds of practice. If you visit any Tibetan Buddhist temple, monastery, or pilgrimage site, you'll likely see people engaging in all sorts of rituals, like bowing in front of lamas or statues, lighting lamps made of butter, burning incense, or making offerings of food or money. Some of these activities can be tied to the 6 perfections. Giving away money or food, for example, is a pretty explicit practice in generosity. But more broadly, many Tibetan Buddhists view these sorts of practices as activities that will earn them merit, a sort of spiritual currency that can help them in this life and in future lives. Merit can be accumulated by practicing the 6 perfections, performing rituals, or engaging in other kinds of virtuous activities. Some merit-making virtuous activities are unique to Tibetan Buddhism and are likely carryovers of practice that existed in pre-Buddhist Tibet. For example, prayer flags. These are multicolored fabric squares with prayers printed on them that are often strung up in high windy places. The flags, which come in 5 different colors, represent the 5 elements, and are believed to send prayers out into the world for all beings every time they flap in the wind. The people who hang these flags earn merit for doing so. Prayer wheels are another common sight in Tibetan Buddhist places. These wheels, which can be small enough to hold in your hand or big enough to require dozens of people to turn, function in a similar sort of way. Prayers are inscribed on and in the wheels, and when they're turned, they send those prayers out to all beings. If you visit a Tibetan Buddhist temple or monastery, you'll often find prayer wheels lining the outside of the building, and you'll see people walking around the building again and again, spinning the wheels as they go, in order to accumulate merit. Turning now to Vajrayana. Vajrayana is a discourse talking about tantric ritual practice, tantras being esoteric ritual manuals focused on the rapid attainment of awakening. The word Vajra is often translated as thunderbolt or diamond. It's a word that refers to something that is powerful and indestructible. So the Vajrayana is considered to be a framework of practice that's incredibly powerful. Unlike the cultivation of the 6 perfections, which can take many lifetimes, the practice of Vajrayana can bring about awakening in a single lifetime. The scholar of Buddhism, Proffitt, compares Paramitayana and Vajrayana to lighting a fire. If Paramitayana is like lighting a fire slowly with a stick, Vajrayana is throwing a lighter into a barrel of gasoline. Rituals that can have rapid results, but are potentially dangerous if not done properly. For this reason, these practices are esoteric. They're generally passed down directly from a teacher to students, and students can enter into tantric practice only after the teacher has determined that the students are sincere, dedicated, and sufficiently prepared, at which point they go through a consecration ritual and take special vows. Despite what you may have heard, Tantra is not just about sex. Though some tantric practice does involve sexual practices, it's actually a complex system of philosophy and ritual that Tibetan Buddhists believe, when practiced properly, has the potential for significant spiritual transformation. One common form of tantric practice involves specific types of visualization meditations. Now, visualization is practiced in all branches of Buddhism, but tantric visualization involves imagining you are becoming a particular deity or bodhisattva. One Tibetan tantric master says that during tantric visualization, while focusing on a particular deity, one transforms oneself into that deity. All objects that appear are likewise made into the deity. Then one's enjoyment is like deity melting into deity. During tantric visualization, as you become one with the deity or bodhisattva you're envisioning, or more accurately, as you literally become the deity, it's believed you can take on their attributes and use their power, maybe achieving rebirth in the Pure Land, attaining Buddhahood in this very lifetime, or gaining and wielding supernatural powers like clairvoyance, telepathy, the ability to fly, or transmute metals. The things that tantric practitioners are asked to visualize in their meditations can be incredibly complex, and so ritual aids are sometimes used to help, such as mudras, esoteric ritualized gestures with the hands, mantras, the recitation of specific formulas, and finally using the visual aids called mandalas. These elaborate patterns are actually depictions of celestial palaces that are believed to be inhabited by particular bodhisattvas. They're generally bird's-eye view representations of multi-story structures. So when a tantric meditator looks at a mandala, they're supposed to imagine it as a three-dimensional place. Mandalas can be painted on canvas or on temple walls, but sometimes they're constructed out of brightly colored sand. These sand mandalas can take a team of trained tantric specialists anywhere from a day or two to several weeks to construct, and they're made by carefully laying down brightly colored sand a few grains at a time. Once the mandala is constructed and is used in its ritual contexts, it's swept up and dumped into the nearest body of flowing water. The creation and destruction of sand mandalas represents, in part, the impermanent nature of all things, and the sand's return to the water represents the idea of interdependence. Because all things are interdependent, you don't just become one with a god or bodhisattva during tantric visualization. You might realize you've always been part of them. Vajrayana has sometimes been used as synonymous with Tibetan Buddhism, but this isn't quite correct. Vajrayana is one component of the Tibetan Buddhist tradition, but a component that has played a major role in its history. Padmasambhava, who, as we mentioned before, is one of the central figures in Tibetan Buddhism, was a tantric master who is believed to be the originator of the terma, or the treasure texts, a tradition of esoteric texts believed to be hidden by Padmasambhava, only to be revealed to later tantric masters years later. The scholar of Tibetan studies, Dr. Don Lopez, likens this process to Joseph Smith discovering the Book of Mormon, a text that he says was supernaturally revealed to him. Tantric practice is also very regulated. The different Tibetan Buddhist orders have a system of tantric colleges where you can go and train. This looks different depending on the monastic order. The Nyingma order runs retreat centers where students go on multi-year retreats where they're guided by a master. The Gaelic order style is more academic, where you go to a tantric college for training and the study of tantric texts. As is often the case with these basic videos, we've barely scratched the surface, though it makes sense to end with the current situation of Tibetan Buddhism. Part of the reason why the Dalai Lama is such a prominent figure on the world stage is due to the tumultuous events of the 20th century. In 1912, after the fall of the Qing dynasty, the previous Dalai Lama, the 13th Dalai Lama, declared independence for Tibet. This de facto self-rule lasted until 1951, when the Communist People's Liberation Army of China, or the PLA, invaded Lhasa and annexed the region. In 1955, many Tibetans took up arms against the PLA. Tibetan Buddhist monasteries became centers of resistance as many fighters took refuge in the monasteries, and many of the monks themselves joined the fight. In 1956, the PLA bombed major Gaelic monasteries in Tibet, such as the Sampling Monastery and the Litang Monastery. And then, in March 1959, the Chinese government suppressed a revolt that broke out in Lhasa, leading the Dalai Lama to flee to India, where he set up a Tibetan government in exile. During the Cultural Revolution in the 60s and 70s, the Communist Party destroyed thousands of Tibetan Buddhist monasteries, demolished their libraries, and imprisoned their monks and nuns. Ongoing government repression of Tibetan culture periodically erupted in protests and violent clashes, such as in 2008 in the months leading up to China hosting the 2008 Summer Olympics. Moreover, because the current Dalai Lama and the Chinese government have tapped two different Panchen Lamas, the one who traditionally chooses the next Dalai Lama, a succession crisis is looming on the horizon. In the midst of all this, the 20th century also witnessed the huge growth of Tibetan Buddhism outside of the region. Soon after the 1959 uprising, Tibetan Buddhist monks who fled Tibet began to build a Tibetan Buddhist infrastructure abroad. Many of these teachers found success teaching Tibetan Buddhism to Western audiences, not through monasteries, but through grassroots organizations based in small centers where people could gather to hear Buddhist teachings and practice meditation. One major popularizer of Tibetan Buddhism in the West was the high-ranking Lama Dudjom Rinpoche. He was a tulku, a tantric master, a revealer of terma texts, and was even believed to be an incarnation of Padmasambhava. He set up Tibetan Buddhist centers in France and the US and led American and European students during retreats. But perhaps the biggest popularizer is none other than the Dalai Lama. Today, the Dalai Lama has formally renounced his role as the political head of state and serves only as a spiritual leader for Tibetan Buddhists. Nevertheless, through his travels, speaking engagements, books, and activism, has helped to make Tibetan Buddhism a global phenomenon. Thanks to NordVPN for sponsoring this video. Quick cybersecurity lesson. There are a few common cybersecurity threats you face online. These include malware, malicious software like viruses that get onto your computer, password attacks when your password gets compromised during a data breach, which seems to happen all the time these days. Something I often face as a YouTuber is phishing. A scammer pretends to be someone else, like the YouTube corporation, and in an email tries to trick me into clicking a link and entering my password. So how do I protect myself? This is where NordVPN comes in. I started using NordVPN a lot when I was living abroad because as a VPN, it was very handy to mask my IP address to access US Netflix or simply to protect my data when on public Wi-Fi connections. But NordVPN also has a new suite of tools called threat protection. This is additional security that works in the background, scanning every file you download looking for malware, blocking internet trackers, or intrusive ads. It's a whole package that protects you against these common cybersecurity threats. If you want to try it out, head on over to nordvpn.com/RFB. You get a huge discount with the purchase of a 2-year plan plus 1 month for free. And because NordVPN is celebrating its 11th birthday, you get an additional gift on top of that. You can try it out risk-free with a 30-day money-back guarantee. Again, that's nordvpn.com/RFB. Thanks, everyone.